Obviously, one of the major contributions to our understanding of the riots was the Reading the Riots study. What would you say was some of the central findings that come from that piece of work then?
I think the kind of crucial thing about Reading the Riots was it's quite an unusual study. So in contrast with a lot of social science research, it was done very quickly. So the initial phase, which focused on the rioters themselves, was probably conducted over a period of 15 or 16 weeks. It was quite short.
Very quick.
So, you know, from raising money, recruiting staff, doing the field work, analysing the data, publishing it in the newspaper was 16 or 17 weeks max, I should think. So extraordinarily quick. And it was, the reason for saying that, I think, is its purpose was to be quick, precisely so as to try to be a part of public and political debate. Our concern, among many, I think, and you know, lots of people will have had similar concerns, was politicians and others were making a whole series of statements about the riots, about what caused them and why people were out on the streets and how we should understand it, and therefore what the public policy response should be. And we felt that, you know, at best some of those statements were pretty far-fetched and certainly weren't evidence-based. And so the attempt was to try to collect some evidence to influence political debate. And I think, broadly speaking, probably the main outcomes of at least that first phase of Reading the Riots were, A, to challenge the idea that this was somehow orchestrated, that the riots were orchestrated by gangs. There was no evidence of that at all. Indeed, in London in particular, there was a truce called between gangs. Secondly, I think to challenge the idea that somehow this was just, or in David Cameron's terms, sheer criminality, that somehow this is precisely the behaviour you would expect of young criminals on the streets. And again, I think it challenged that very successfully in all sorts of ways. But thirdly, I think putting the police and police conduct or attitudes towards the police, history of poor police-community relations and police conduct at the centre of the narrative about the riots. And in particular, I think Theresa May, the Home Secretary's decision to review stop and search practices, which was obviously based on lots of influence, but was announced at the Reading the Riots conference. I think, you know, I think we can claim some small part at least in bringing that about. So I think that's kind of...
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, the point that you make there about engaging academic research with public policy is something that requires us to sharpen up our act and make our evidence and analysis available far quicker than we normally do. You know, not simply being about a journal publication exercise. That impact is far more political than that, and political processes are very, very quick. But I think it's relevant to focus on that issue about the way in which the discourse, the way in which the riots were represented in the media in particular, and that disconnect between academic research, evidence and theory, and the way in which they were represented was I think, quite shocking at times. And it struck me that that was one of the main issues, was the way in which our work around riots and crowds, while making a significant impact in terms of police thinking and so on that had flowed from the G20 protests and the death of Mr. Tomlinson, that suddenly all of that went out the window. And what was reasserted on the front page was mob psychology, mindlessness, and as you say, these ideas about the violence being caused by criminal gangs or simply being some kind of dysfunction within certain elements of society. And of course, Reading the Riots does place a focus on policing. What would you say it is about policing that is important to understanding riots?
First of all, in terms of the focus on communities and what's happened since the riots and investments and so forth, and I'm sure we will come back to this when we talk about Leeds, it's remarkable, I think, that standard discourse, as it were, manages to talk about disorder, riots on the streets in particular communities as if the relative impoverishment of those communities, and they almost always are relatively impoverished communities, had no part to play, that poverty, that's, you know, social disengagement, that a general sense of disenfranchisement amongst many people who live in those communities somehow doesn't seem to occur to politicians, or at least they are unwilling, and I'll come back to this in a moment, to acknowledge that those things may be important in our understanding of why on certain occasions things get out of control and riots occur. Now, the second thing I would say is, I mean, having said that, I'm not sure that this is terribly shocking in the sense that the standard political discourse around riots is always thus. It's always to seek scapegoats or folk devils or however one wants to think about these things. And so in a way, we possibly shouldn't be too shocked that the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary or the Commissioner of the Police or whoever seek, I think, to focus attention away from their own responsibilities as people in charge of public policy, or indeed their responsibilities as senior officers in charge of, you know, what their forces do. So, which brings you back to the police, which I think is, you know, what the things that we were focusing on reading the riots were quite varied, and they were varied from, you know, all the way from a spectrum of things, from a history of poor police-community relationships in Broadwater Farm, or Chapeltown, even in Leeds, Toxteth, Handsworth, Moss Side, wherever else, through to the more immediate, but nonetheless kind of medium to long-term sense that many of the people who are out on the streets talked about their at best very poor relationships with the police, and then most particularly what was perceived to be, and I think in many ways very justifiably, the inappropriate use of police powers, particularly around stop and search, and the oppressive use of those powers within local communities, focusing especially on particular groups, not least of all young black men.
Very important that you bring out that way in which these understandings of riots function ideologically, but it does point towards the way in which our understanding of riots has this very important ideological and political function that I think is very, very important for us to understand. And the other thing I think is where we talk about policing is that we need to be very clear, I think, that analysis doesn't equal blame. That quite often when we start to analyse as academics, the attribution is made that we are seeking to blame the police, where in actual fact I think what we're trying to do is to understand what the potential underlying processes are and to articulate our theoretical understanding with the kind of data that we extract out of these circumstances, one of which is the data around the way that they're represented, and the other is the way in which the data talks to us about the underlying phenomenology, the people involved and how they experienced it. And one thing that's very clear about that is that for people involved, their understanding of policing was critically important. And as you say, there's this background context of stop and search that seems to feature very heavily in how people understood the reason that they were involved in the riots. But I think there's a problem here about the way that we talk about the riots as if it's some kind of singular event. And what strikes me from our analysis is that there is a complexity to these events that's somehow overwritten. We, as you know, focused initially on trying to understand the origins of the riot outside of the police station in Tottenham, the first of the big riots. And where we looked at that, there was a complexity about the fact that there was a peaceful demonstration beforehand that went on for 3 hours. A lot of people don't know that there was various attempts to get the police to make a formal acknowledgement to Mark Duggan's family that he had actually been shot and that that hadn't taken place. And that these processes seem to have played a role in why that first riot broke out. Do you think that that's a valid way of looking at it?
Well, I think the point you make there is hugely important in the sense that, you know, and I'm probably guilty of it too, but there's always a danger in talking about, you know, the 2011 England riots, that somehow one implies that this was a singular set of events, you know, that could all be understood through the same frame. When what happened in Tottenham, as you're saying, on that Saturday evening was really quite different from what happened subsequently in Hackney, not maybe entirely, but certainly different from what then happened in Brixton, certainly from what happened in Ealing a couple of days later. And to try to make sense of, I think, the London riots as if they were singular events, but as if they were the same as what happened in Nottingham or Salford or Liverpool is to simplify enormously complicated events. And it was one of the great sadnesses, in a way, of reading the riots, I think, that quite unwittingly, I think we played into the hands of people who would portray the research study itself in that kind of singular, monolithic way. In the first day of publication, we had a front page story which set out a whole series of things about poverty, the impoverishment of local communities, the non-involvement of gangs, difficulties with the police, particularly around stop and search, the difficulty in identifying any kind of clear ethnic participation or message within these riots, and so on and so forth. Really all sorts of really quite complicated messages also around consumption and looting and so forth. But the headline on the front of the newspaper was "Blame the Police, Why the Rioters Say They Took Part." And in a way what happened subsequently over the following 5 or 6 days of publicity was that that was the only frame of reference within which, for a lot of people at least, reading the riots was understood.
Yeah, it's the danger of trying to engage your theories and evidence with politics is it takes on the dynamics of politics once it's out there. And I think it's very interesting that you bring that to bear on how people have interpreted the complexity of the analysis in very simplistic terms, which has fed into the ongoing political dispute. Because what struck me as well about the debates that were happening at the time was that there was a position put forward by the government that spoke to us very much about a police failure in terms of a failure to crack down. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it wouldn't be my interpretation of these events at all. You know, one of the really interesting things I think about the 2011 riots is that for the first time really that I can remember, they broke Michael Ignatieff's first rule of post-riot political discourse, which is whatever else you do as a politician, praise the police. And what we had here, unlike the 1980s riots or those more recently, was politicians getting stuck into the police quite quickly, being deeply critical indeed, not only critical of the police, but implying that the escalation in police numbers and the shift, to the extent there was a shift, in police tactics towards the end of the 4 days of Troubles was somehow a result of political intervention. And that's an extraordinary shift, I think. But to a degree, and I'd be interested in your views on this, my interpretation of at least elements of the first 2 days of police response in London was that, although in part I think there was a lack of decisiveness because there was a lack of clarity about the extent to which or how much force should be used. Nonetheless, much of what was occurring was still influenced by a kind of Scarman-esque model of minimum use of force.
Well, I think it's important to contextualise where the police were at that point, which is just off the back of a radical reform in policy that was something that grew out of the G20 protest. And the key thing there is about making policing human rights compliant and staying committed to the British policing model, which is very much about minimal use of force. And I think there's a massive amount of misrepresentation about what the police were faced with as the riots began to grow and escalate. Now, it couldn't have been the case that anybody would have had any understanding that these riots were growing until we saw the second round of rioting begin on the Sunday night in London. And at that point, and I would argue only at that point, could it have been justifiable to start thinking about some kind of major mobilisation. And that certainly occurred by Monday. To mobilise from normal police duties, 7,000 cops onto the streets within 24 hours, I think is a major achievement. I think that mobilisation itself had an escalatory dynamic. And that's particularly true, I think, around Hackney, because by Monday afternoon there was the expectation among everybody that there was going to be further disorder. So it was almost waiting to happen, and everybody was kind of looking for it. Then, as I understand it, there was a stop and search incident in the Narrows in Hackney, and as a consequence, police started to mobilise into that area. And when they mobilised into that area, it appears to me that they engaged in a dispersal exercise that escalated the problem. But nonetheless, subsequently, by the following day, we have somewhere in the region of 16,000 police on the streets of London. And what's critically important, I think, is that the disorder stopped. And the mobilisation had the effect, and it was a very rapid mobilisation. And as I say, to achieve that was quite an achievement. So to stand back then and say, well, something went wrong with our policing, I think is more political discourse. It's more about trying to suggest that the problems aren't ones of government policy and so on and so forth. And I think that we're wrong to see things in those terms. And I think that we need to be much more sophisticated in our understanding of how policing works and how public order policing works, and the principles around which public order policing is based, if we want to have a serious debate about the role of public order policing in these kind of riot dynamics.
I mean, I'm really interested to hear you say it, and I think I agree with everything you say there, that huge numbers of police officers are mobilised across the country in most of our major urban centres. Actually, they managed to, much of the time, I think, rein in any desire there was, certainly political influence there was, to see much more force used.
Yeah, and I think the political influence was a key dynamic here, because there was clearly a drive on the part of the government to take a more reactionary position for whatever reason. But then we've got this sense in which the Metropolitan Police Service, when they reflect on how they dealt with the situation, one of the utterances that they use is that we filled prison cells, not hospital beds. But the 2011 riots did pose new problems for the police. First, that problem of being criticised for a lack of force in an environment where they're also criticised for an overbearing force, and to find a position within that was going to be acceptable. But the fact that they were criticised for being too soft opened up a new door. And that door was very much about feeling as though the British public was in a position to accept something more in terms of police use of force. And that something more is the use of firearms. And the use of firearms was something that grew out of Birmingham. And you will remember that one of the features of the rioting in Birmingham was that there were groups, gangs, organised groups who were armed with live ammunition and did fire live ammunition at police. So what we see then is subsequently the HMIC inquiry into police responses during the riots starts to enable serious discussion and development of tactics based around use of live ammunition in riot situations. And unfortunately what we're in now is a situation where that tactic exists. So we've got a change in how policing is in this country, which I think has somewhat gone under the radar. But when I look at the analysis that was put forward by the Metropolitan Police about the riots, one of the things about their report, I think it's called 4 Days in August, is it points actually very, very clearly to a failure of dialogue. That when they tried to analyse the origins of the riots in Tottenham, they make very clear that there were failures in respect to communicating with the family of Mark Duggan, and there were failures in dealing in a communicative way with the protest that gathered outside of the police station. And that it was those failures in communication that had a big impact on the dynamics of that event. And it strikes me that if we hadn't have had the riot in Tottenham, we may not have had the spread. But that brings us to a key point about the 2011 riots, the spread. Many people would call it the contagion, if you like, the spread from Tottenham, firstly into London, and then into other cities. What are your thoughts on the spread and how the spread happened, why the spread happened?
Well, I think it's a kind of constant question in relation to major outbreaks of rioting. We've seen it plenty of times before. Perhaps the big difference between the riots of 2011 and those of 1981 and 1985 is the speed with which the rioting spread. Here we're talking 3 days, essentially. 3 to 4 days max for this to cover 5, 6, 7 cities. Whereas in the mid-1980s, it's 3 months from Brixton then to other parts of London and outside of London. Why that should be the case and how these things spread, I think, is really, to a degree, one of the big unanswered questions in social science, really. Yeah. I don't think we're much further forward in all this. I mean, I'd be interested to hear your views in it, but that's my sense of it. To the extent that speed here was an obvious characteristic of 2011, I think some of that is to do with the availability of various forms of media now. Both traditional media, but 24-hour rolling news and so forth, is the constant, as it were, presence of pictures and huge amounts of information, actually, both on the web and on TV about the riots, but also the use of social media, which allowed people to communicate in ways which had obviously not been possible in almost every previous experience of writing. But that doesn't get us further than beginning to think about sort of the speed and malleability of riots. I don't think it tells us much about contagion. Where this is possibly, though, where the question about why riots don't happen in certain places becomes particularly pertinent. So we can ask questions about what it was about Birmingham or Manchester or St Anne's in Nottingham or various outlying parts of Liverpool, which produced, where tensions and grievances and so forth then spilled into violence or looting or both. But perhaps the kind of social scientific question and our kind of theoretical attempts to make sense of these things is aided most of all by looking at places where you might plausibly think this rioting, this contagion, if we like that word, might have reached. But where for some reason things were brought under control and didn't tip into full-scale rioting. I don't know what your sense.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's about the pattern of that spread, the pattern of collective action. And as you're aware, my background is in crowd psychology, and our journey of theoretical development in crowd psychology has been very much informed by the social historians of the 20th century, Rood A. Thompson and so on, who make very clear that one of the things that we need to understand about rioting, certainly as industrial society develops, is that it has a normative pattern that can't be understood in terms of contagion theory, the dominant idea that somehow we see this spread disease-like because of the underlying pathology of group psychology, crowd psychology. And that where we look at the patterns of collective action that occur in riots, they're very normatively structured. So if we then translate that into the 2011 riots and go back to our conversation about the requirement to understand in a more nuanced way about what went on, the first question we need to ask is, well, what were the patterns? What were the patterns of rioting? And I've seen some interesting work by colleagues of mine, Roger Ball and John Drury, who've done some analysis of that. That talk about different types of riot. That if we take riots like Tottenham and like Hackney and look at the patterns of collective action, we see very much they're targeted at the police. And there's actually very little looting that goes on. And where looting does occur, it's quite often about getting ammunition to attack the police and so on and so forth.
The same, for what it's worth, is true of St Anne's in Nottingham, and to a degree what happened in Liverpool, I would say.
So we've got
and Salford.
That pattern of rioting, but then we've also got corresponding what they call more focused on class-based riots. So if we take things like Enfield and places like that, where the pattern of collective action changes, where you've got groups mobilising into areas that are understood to be affluent and attacking symbols of wealth and not appropriating but destroying. And then you've got a corresponding third type that we can consider as a commodity riot, but it becomes problematic to even call it a riot because there's not so much attempts to attack the police, there's not so much violence, it's very much about avoiding the police and appropriating. So different patterns of collective action, and we can't conceptualise all of those events in those terms. So when we look at that spread and we start to consider the contagion, one of the key challenges we've got, as you point out, is not simply explaining why violence spread, it's also explaining why violence didn't spread. What were the limits of that spread in terms of cities like Nottingham becoming violent and problematic, Birmingham becomes violent and problematic, but Sheffield and Leeds don't. Now I know that you've done some work around the situation in Leeds in that respect, because of course Leeds is a city that has a history of rioting, particularly in Chapeltown. And one of the things that I wanted us to discuss today was the situation in Chapeltown and why things didn't escalate to any great extent there. What would you say the data that you've come across from Chapeltown tells you about why riots didn't develop here?
Well, my starting point in all this was to look for areas which you might plausibly think disorder might have spread to, which is to say that in some sense they share some of the structural, social, economic, political and cultural characteristics of those neighbourhoods and communities where rioting did break out, so Tottenham or Hackney or wherever else. Now, Chapeltown, I think, falls fairly and squarely, more obviously than almost anywhere, into that as a district, a neighbourhood, which, as you say, has a history of rioting, has a history and a long-standing one of less than ideal police-community relations, conflict with the police. Historically has been a relatively impoverished community by any measure. The broad, I would say, structural and economic characteristics are there. Then, beyond that, Chapeltown has the unique characteristic of itself having seen a shooting in the midst of the disorder carrying on elsewhere in the country. So, if you like, something which, you know, in some theories might be characterised as a spark or a flashpoint, with some subsequent disorder, but not something which probably would be characterised as full-scale rioting. So, I mean, it seemed to me to have all the kind of major elements which would allow you in some way to explore this rather underexplored question of why riots don't, or in this occasion, didn't happen.
Yeah. We see there that in the context of the spread of violence on the Monday in particular, where there were widespread concerns across the UK, in the Chapeltown district there was a young man who was shot, ultimately died 4 days later. It portrays a situation that was very, very volatile. And then I understand that the incident develops into something far more serious, and we had a situation where a senior police commander was assaulted. And what we then see as a slightly more challenging set of circumstances about a pressure to intervene here on the part of the police as a function of, firstly, the expectation that riots were going to develop as part of the wider spread of the disorder, but secondly, because of the serious nature of what's just happened to the police commander. What are your thoughts?
Our researcher spoke to both Lutel and Claude originally, and I mean, it strikes me that moment, the moment where they are contacted by the police commander, go to the police headquarters, go to the police station, and there's a dialogue. The police, understandably, are all effectively tooled up and ready to go, and an agreement is made for a brief period where they have some freedom to go and talk to people, negotiate, get out on the streets, see if the situation can be calmed in any kind of way, is the most extraordinary moment. Because what it illustrates, almost better than anything, I think, beyond, as it were, the extraordinary work they did, is the position a senior police commander finds themselves in under these circumstances, which is frankly between a rock and a hard place. So in this particular case, you've got huge political pressure. You know, by this stage, at least behind the scenes, senior figures in Whitehall are being deeply critical of members of the Metropolitan Police and no doubt other forces besides. There's a lot of political messages going out saying we don't want any more of this, we want this calmed, whatever it takes, folks. we want this to stop. As you say, there's been a shooting, tensions are very high in Chapeltown between the Black and Asian community, between the community and the police, all the kind of building blocks for something really serious here. There, the police commander has herself been attacked. The police are ready to go. To stop, to put the brake on at that stage is, by any measure, an extraordinarily brave police act. Because if you do the sort of counterfactual history, how would that have been understood had it worked out differently? Had major rioting broken out, had someone or several people been very badly hurt, or worse still, killed, how would that act then have been interpreted? Not well is the answer. And so, you know, everything hinges on that, it seems to me. That's the moment, if you're looking for a moment, where the story of Chapeltown at least has the potential for change.
It was a critical 40 minutes, and as you say, that 40 minutes put that police commander in an incredibly difficult position where she was experiencing pressure from above and, in some senses, from below. To intervene. And I think it's important to contextualise it in the way that you did there, that this was Monday afternoon, where I think around about sort of 2, 3, perhaps 4 o'clock, David Cameron had come out and openly criticised the police for being too reticent about intervening. So that pressure must have been acute. And when we look to what they then did, what strikes me as most important about it was that they gave space for community-based interventions, that essentially this was a space in which what we might call a neighbourhood policing model based around dialogue and community engagement was given space to operate, that then starts to see some sort of subsequent benefit in de-escalation. Do you think that is reflected in the data from Reading the Riots as well?
Very strongly, and in two ways, I would say. I mean, not only reflected in the data collected in Leeds, but also, to reinforce a point you've made, in the data collected in Tottenham, which is to say that's precisely what didn't happen in Tottenham, I think. So your diagnosis, which is that the 48 hours in between the shooting of Mark Duggan and the eventual escalation into something close to full-scale disorder in Tottenham is something, I think, arguably, that could have been prevented, that full-scale disorder. And precisely the problem was the absence of communication, the failure to talk to the family, the failure to invite the family into the police station, or alternatively to have senior officers capable of engaging in serious dialogue with people on the streets and enabling family and friends to talk to others out on the streets with the potential of de-escalating the trouble, is simply what didn't occur, as it were. So it's the reverse, what didn't happen story, I think. And in particular, I mean, one doesn't want to single out individuals, but as it were, the experience in Chapeltown of a well-established set of relationships between community organisers and the local police commander is something which didn't really exist in Tottenham. You know, the local police commander there simply didn't have that history or set of relationships which might have so easily enabled, I think, the kind of dialogue and communication that was necessary to de-escalate.
On the one hand, the Metropolitan Police is a big organisation, and one of the difficulties here is that the local policing operation had to interface with a pan-London operation. When we transfer this analysis to Chapeltown, as you point out in your analysis, that it is based around the capability for some kind of prior investment in a community police trust and confidence issue that can only come from some significant investment in that prior to the events themselves. It's because there had been that investment in community-based organisations, from funding from local authorities, one presumes, and also an investment by the police in a neighbourhood policing model to build up trust and confidence, that they were able to exploit that at those critical moments. And that's not something you can just plug in on the day. It's something that has to be a strategic commitment on the part of local authorities and the police to invest in that social capital.
The financial metaphor, as it were, is an important one here in the sense, I mean, it's not just a metaphor, but the idea that, you know, personal, cultural and individual and social capital is vital here. And those are things which don't, as it were, spring up in some kind of unthought through, overnight way. They're things which require a huge amount of background work, and indeed, to pick up your phrase, which is absolutely the right one, investment, both personal and individual investment, and financial, social, cultural investment in local communities. So on the one hand, the more particular thing is, it requires individuals doing this work over a long period of time. You know, individuals, community organisers, community folk like Lutal and Claude, over many years, establishing relationships and trust both within the community and with the police service, but also local police officers, from the local police commander, no doubt, on down through neighbourhood officers, working day after day, week after week, to establish relationships, bonds, a degree of trust. And then beyond that, as you say, I think social investment, economic investment in local communities. We started out by saying, you know, one of the reasons that you would focus on Chapeltown as a place with at least the potential for disorder is not just its history, but its history of impoverishment. And it's only by, and you know, what's been sad to see, I think, in the aftermath of the riots is the failure to take the opportunity to invest properly in communities, both affected by riots and also, in this case, not so affected by riots, to try to, as it will, build the basis for the emergence of that kind of capital.
Yeah, and I think that that's particularly true in a context of austerity, where the debates are very much about where are we going to invest limited funds. And what strikes me as quite problematic is that the community activists that played such an important role in preventing the escalation, potentially in Chapeltown, if our analysis is correct, are now finding themselves with money being withdrawn from their organisation. Their view is that, in a sense, their intervention has been counterproductive, because had there been disorder in Chapeltown, had there been then the perception that there were underlying failures that need to be addressed, that the likelihood is that the council may well not have withdrawn the funding that they actually require as so central to the successes that we think underpinned why it was that you didn't get the spread.
Yeah, I mean, you can understand the frustration, I think, if that's the case. And there's a kind of bitter irony if, you know, people whose work is so central to what is a success story feel that, you know, it's had some rather unfortunate unintended consequences. But of course, I guess what I'd say is that what people have to hang on to is the fact that as a result of their intervention, their community was not burnt to the ground. You know, so as it were, the positive outcome is that local facilities such as they are, albeit now perhaps without investment, don't require complete rebuilding. And you know, what we saw in so many places around England in 2011 was just appalling destruction. And destruction which takes years and years, assuming there is any investment, to even get back to where you were, albeit in a fairly poor, impoverished state in August 2011. Rather reinforcing the last point, ironically, you know, Chapeltown found itself in 2011 in a slightly better position than it might otherwise have been because of inward investment, at least some inward investment, and investment precisely because it had been a place where previously there'd been riots. So, you know, in a sense, that both is a positive story, I think, in that it helps identify what potentially might be a sort of some protective factor in some small way against disorder having occurred in 2011. But with the irony then that the absence of riots on this occasion may have served to bring about something quite different, which is the withdrawal of funding from some particularly crucial local services.
I think one of the important issues that we have to confront around analysis of the riots is that, unlike the 1980s riots, where we saw the Scarman report, a kind of official analysis, and subsequent academic interest funded by the research councils and so on. We saw a great deal of academic analysis, theoretical analysis. From within criminology, there was the growth of particular perspectives that culminated, one could argue, in David Waddington's flashpoints model. And in social psychology, the growth and development of a social identity perspective. I wondered if we could start to discuss now where we are following the 2011 riots academically. Are we at a point where our academic theory is adequate to explain and understand what went on? And if it is, or if not, where do we need to see our developments?
I think the whole territory of the sort of the attempt at theoretical explanation of writing and its absence is an intriguing one, in the sense that, as I think you've rightly said to me, much of the sort of sociological work grew out of and was a reaction to both what occurred in the 1980s in terms of writing, but also the political context in which those experiences were understood. Now, I personally have found, when coming to think about the 2011 riots, the flashpoints model quite helpful. But let me say how, because I think this is important and leads potentially to what I think is a possible useful dialogue between sociology and social psychology here, which is the flashpoints model. It seems to me is very helpful analytically, which is to say, in terms of trying to make sense, so far as I was concerned, of the complex and very varied conditions under which rioting took place, and the very complex variety of events that we try to describe under the label riots, that distinguishing analytically between various levels, whatever we may wish to call them, but structural, cultural, political, contextual and interactional, is a useful way of compartmentalising, albeit I think analytically rather than actually, compartmentalising our thinking about things as varied as the history of a local community, all the way through to the potential analysis of the precise interactions between members of crowds, the police, or others. But the difficulty, I think, comes when trying to, for example, get into the detail of the differences between, in some ways, our subjects today, why rioting occurs, for example, as an illustration in one place but not in another. Then the model, I think, possibly requires some greater specification, or an alternative approach which allows you to think more about the very specific details, both not just contextually but interactionally, of what occurs in particular temporal and geographic spaces.
Yeah, I think I share your positive view on flashpoints. I think it is a major contribution to our theoretical understanding of disorder. What he also makes clear is that it's the meanings of those interactions and the perceptions of people involved in them that are very, very important to understand. Yet at the same time, it's an area of the theory that I think it's at its weakest, and at which point the social identity perspective that equally re-injects meaning into collective action in riots focuses at that interactional level to help us to understand the dynamics through which these things come about. And I think that where we look at those early academic debates around rioting and public order policing, we've got this very important debate that went on with the Waddingtons, the Peter and David, the Tank and David Waddington debates, that were where Peter Waddington focused his critique of the flashpoints model in much the same terms that you just have, is that he argues that it's quite circular, that on the one hand it doesn't really help us to understand why we get that variation, because all of the conditions in one place, for example in Chapeltown and in London, are the same at that contextual level. But in one place we don't get violence and in the other we do. And that the only reason that we can even consider these moments as flashpoints is because disorder breaks out. If it doesn't break out, then we don't get a flashpoint and we can't, it's a kind of circular analysis. And I think that this is a big limitation about where we are at the moment. And I think the other issue to bear in mind is that there is a requirement here for some kind of interdisciplinary dialogue. We are, I think, at a place in academia where the challenges of the 21st century can only be addressed in interdisciplinary terms, and that we need to learn from each other to start to address these limitations in a meaningful way. And one of the things that strikes me about your analyses, both of the presence and the absence of disorder, is that they talk to us very clearly about the centrality of those interaction processes. Would you say that that's a fair understanding?
Well, yes, I think it is. I mean, what's interesting for me, I mean, talking to you about, as it were, these complex events is, you know, I'm a sociologist by training, not a psychologist. And I suppose one of the things that I have just struggled with for a very long time is, I think sociology has been quite good at enabling us to see in more or less nuanced ways and understand, as it were, both the kind of long-standing and broad, but also more immediate social and economic and political contexts within which rioting does and doesn't occur. But what's always been missing, and what is inherently problematic in all explanations, I think, though you'll explain why it's much less problematic from a social psychological perspective, is what's the mechanism? How is it that those things become translated into forms of action or reaction, which we would understand as violence and disorder and so forth? And sociological theory has been very good, if you like, on the moral economy of the crowd, but much less good, and this would be Tank Waddington's criticism, I think, on what are the mechanisms that enable this to occur. And that's what's attracted me to, well, through your encouragement, to read and try to engage with the social identity model as something which offers the possibility of making sense of interpreting precisely that that interactional mechanism.
Yeah, and I think it's important in that sense to articulate at some level a meta-theoretical perspective that, on the one hand, if we look at flashpoints, to a certain extent it's a model that points us towards contextual or social determination, that there are these broad contextual structural issues that feed into the processes through which riots develop. Whereas the social identity perspective is a theoretical model that grows up in a meta-theoretical context of interactionism, that we recognise that at some level the self is socially determined. Who we are, how we define ourselves, and what we feel it's appropriate to do as a consequence is not something just about our individuality, and that we have a way of defining ourselves in terms of our group membership, and that the definitions of self in those terms, what it means to be a male, what it means to be a socialist, for example, are socially determined. Where we understand this at the level of the self, we can begin to understand how and why it is that collective action in the context of a riot takes on a socially determined form. But what we've also begun to understand is that where we see the patterns of collective action in a riot as an outcome of social identity processes, that those social identity processes can be shaped and reshaped in the context of the interactions of a crowd event. And that's why public order policing is so important to how and why it is that often riots come about. And one of the things that I think we fail to articulate in the academic debates is the way in which, when we theorise and talk about riots, we're always talking about big urban riots, the 1980, 81, the 2011. But there are riots happening all the time, in football, at the poll tax, demonstrations and so on. And these processes are quite observable on an ongoing basis to understand how it is that collective violence, collective conflict comes about in a crowd event.
I mean, there's something of an irony, it feels to me, in this, in the terminology and the nomenclature that's used, because the social identity model, the elaborated social identity model, focuses in the main, I'm not saying for a moment that it doesn't take account of the broader, deeper structural issues, but it focuses its primary attention on the more immediate interactional,
kind of the micro-sociology.
On the micro-sociology of violent events in this case, or their absence, yes? In different, not that I particularly want to use the terminology, but in a different way, you could say that its primary focus is on what sometimes would be thought of as flashpoints. Yeah, those things which, if they turn out one way, might lead to violence, or in another might lead to the de-escalation of conflicts. There's, as you say, the micro-sociological interaction of particular groups under certain circumstances. The irony is, I think, that to the extent that the flashpoints model doesn't really focus in detail, I mean, it allows for those things, but doesn't focus in a kind of structured analytical way on those interactions, it's misnamed. That actually the model that we know of as the flashpoints model is primarily, as you were describing it, and probably as I have mainly used it, as something which helps us focus our attentions on those broader and deeper social structural conditions under which the micro-sociological events then become important.
Yeah, the meanings. And what's important about our analysis as well is that we too are focused on particularly important other debates, primarily within our own discipline originally, about trying to move away from reductionist, psychologically reductionist models of the self, and in order to explain the social determination of behaviour. And those broader macro social contextual determinants are addressed initially in Steve Reicher's development of the model, initially around the St Paul's riot, to locate the determining role of the context of antagonism between certain institutions of the state, the police, the social security system and so on, feeding into a particular sense of what it means to be black in Britain in the 1980s, and how that sense of self then feeds into these patterns of collective action and help us to understand it. He was arguing against the Lebonian irrationalist model to say, look, you can't explain this without some notion of the social determination of self. And my work, as you quite rightly point out, then begins to grow and develop that model by focusing on the micro-sociology. And for us, when we begin to look at the development of riots, such as the poll tax riot, it becomes clear that there is a group-level dynamic, an intergroup interaction that can occur in a crowd event, that where people in the crowd perceive out-group action as illegitimate, that can create the conditions for identity change, such that people can become unified in opposition to the police. And that unity changes the power dynamic. So there's a legitimacy and power dynamic that goes on in crowds that helps us to begin to articulate the processes through which, as you point out, the flashpoint essentially starts to develop. So it seems to me that what we're looking at here is a fantastic opportunity to start a very meaningful debate in terms of taking criminological theory forward, and that one of the opportunities that we might have here is to start a rich debate around flashpoints and around the social identity model as an attempt to try to advance our theoretical understanding of these kinds of incidents.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk with us today, Tim.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been
terrific.
valuable for you. It has been for me. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure. It's been great.